All right, Political Science 100. We're picking up for the second part of the discussion of the presidency, and we're going to transition from talking about the president as a person to talking about the executive branch of government and the executive bureaucracy. So I want you to differentiate and distinguish between the president as a person, an individual, the presidency as the institution immediately surrounding the president, and then the overall vast executive branch of government. And a theme for what I'm about to get into here is one of the major obstacles that confronts any president who would like to control government in the way that a CEO might control a company is the inability of a president to actually exercise that kind of control over even his executive branch of government. And I'll continue to use the sexist language until we have a woman as president. So, remember, of course, we have three branches of government. They each are separate and with the ability to check and balance each other. So what I'm getting at is not just the president's inability to make Congress do what he wants or the courts do what he wants, but even his own branch of government. I mean, if you thought, you think of the president as the most powerful position on earth, basically, you would think, that being the case, that the person could control at least the entity that he's elected to lead. And yet, as we'll see, that is often very much not the case. You'll recall federalism from a conversation we had some discussions ago. Federalism, one of the big themes of federalism was the rise in the role and the size of the federal government over the history of our nation. And so there were really, in terms of the rise of and the growth of the federal government, there are really two things that are important to think about. First, just the increase in the sheer number of executive branch government employees, just how much larger in size the executive branch has gotten with federalism. But equally important is a change in the basis on which those executive branch government employees are hired and fired, and the extent to which the president has any say in that. So we'll get into that. This is the executive branch of government in 1801. This is the third administration in the history of our country. Thomas Jefferson was elected president, Aaron Burr the vice president. James Madison was Secretary of State. You see the other cabinet positions, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, now called Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, the Postmaster General, and the Secretary of the Navy. And that was it. That was the entirety of the federal government. And as I said, this is the third administration. If you look at the first administration, it was George Washington and a few people taking notation and helping him write and answer letters. That's it. He had Alexander Hamilton as his Treasury Secretary and Jefferson as Secretary of State, and really not much more. So I want to distinguish between the president versus just the president as a person versus the institution immediately surrounding the president, which we call the executive office of the president or the presidency. So here's a flow chart, I guess, an organizational chart of the entirety of the United States government, as best anyone could possibly put all the entities of government on a single organizational chart. I think people tend to think of Congress, the legislative branch, as being the largest branch of government because there are so many members of Congress, 535. In fact, that's not the case. I think the relative size is conveyed pretty nicely here in terms of the components of this chart. Over here is the legislative branch. This is Congress. This is House and Senate and the related offices to that. Over here are the courts. And then here, running down through the entire center, is the executive branch of government. So here you have the president, and this cluster of offices that we'll talk a little bit about later is the executive office of the president. All of this down here are the cabinet departments, and headed by cabinet secretaries that the president appoints, and then all the different agencies of the executive bureaucracy, regulatory agencies and independent agencies and government corporations that comprise the totality of the rest of the executive branch of government. So you've got the individual person, the president, right here. You've got a large body of offices that constitutes the executive office of the presidency, all of this. And then you've got the entirety of the executive branch of government. And just to give you some sense of how large this is, right here is the Department of Defense This little box here represents that cabinet agency. And down here there will be the CIA and intelligence agencies. If you take just the national security apparatus, all of this complexity, this huge bureaucracy, the Secretary of Defense and the Defense Department all over here, the CIA, our Central Intelligence Agency over here, connecting to the National Security Council, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, to the President's office. This right here is itself a massive bureaucracy that really represents just one tiny part, this part and some down here, of this overall bureaucracy. And we could even drill down further and look just at the Department of Defense and get us. So this is just a subsection of this, which is just a subsection of this. My point here is not for you to absorb all the complexities of these organizational charts, but just to get a sense of how massive the size of the federal government is in terms of the executive branch of government today as compared to 222 years ago. There are thousands and thousands of offices housed in agencies and departments, 4.5 million people working in the executive branch of government when you combine civilian and military personnel together. And as I said, it's not just the number of federal employees that we have today as compared to what it used to be, but also how they are appointed and how they could be removed. They're hiring and they're firing. The reality is that the President of the United States has CEO-like control, the ability to hire or fire or tell people what to do over just a tiny fraction of those 4.4 million people. The vast majority of them, he can't hire them, he can't remove them, and they don't really have to listen to him. Once upon a time, the president had much more control than that over the executive branch of government, over his own branch of government. Once upon a time, federal government jobs went to people through a patronage system. Patronage, it's a system in which the winner gets to name all the people of his branch of government. To the victor go the spoils. So presidents would appoint jobs to their friends. Federal jobs were considered plum jobs. And so when a president would take office after winning an election, he would have control over handing out all these choice federal government positions. And so he would give them out to loyalists, and he would give them out in return for campaign support. People were hired because they were friends of the president, because they had supported the president. And so they were hired on the basis of that kind of support, and they could be fired if that support wavered. The good thing about this was that the president knew he had loyalists working for him, people who would do what he wanted them to do and do what he told them to do. So that's great, I guess, if you're leading an organization. There's a very famous political cartoon. This is President Chester A. Arthur handing out these government jobs and being beseeched by job seekers who are promising support and asking for jobs in return for past support, and also promising to support President Arthur in the upcoming campaign with financial contributions. So these are loyalists seeking the pleasure and government jobs of the president. The bad thing about that system was it bred incompetence and corruption. These jobs were filled by people not because of their knowledge base or skills in the area they were designated to lead, or because of any expertise on their part. They were hired because of their support and loyalty for the president and their financial support for the president. So there was a lot of corruption in the system. The people were buying federal jobs via campaign contributions. Elected officials were demanding money from federal government employees basically intimidating them or coercing them to give political support in order to keep their jobs. There was a lot of incompetence and inefficiency and corruption under the patronage system. And when the branch of government, the executive branch of government, the branch of government that actually implements what government does, is noted for its incompetence, inefficiency, and corruption, that's not a good thing. So, along came reform. Congress passed the Pendleton Act of 1883, which is a reform act that banned the kinds of behaviors I just described. It became illegal to solicit campaign contributions from federal employees. And federal government jobs were awarded on the basis of merit, knowledge, competence, demonstrated through competitive exams. And federal employees could no longer be fired for political reasons. And what resulted was a much more efficient, much less corrupt administration of government. a much more professional administration of government. The executive branch became more professional in its operation. It also became a lot less politically responsive to the president. And continuing through today, the executive branch is less responsive to the president. With the increase in the size of the federal government, presidents have had much more difficulty running, as a CEO might or a commander might, their own branch of government. When we get into the bureaucracy in the next section, we'll get into the supposed deep state conspiracy theory that some, particularly President Trump and his followers, have blamed for the resistance of the federal government against the initiatives of President Trump. And I'll give away right now that there is no deep state conspiracy. What there is, however, is an executive branch of government that is often disinclined to follow the lead of the president and the cabinet appointees that he names to head agencies, because they have different perspectives and different missions. And we'll get into the details of that when we talk about the bureaucracy. But let me give you an example. Here are three people that President Trump named to head cabinet agencies in his term in office. He named a guy named Scott Pruitt to head the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Scott Pruitt is a close ally of the fossil fuel industry. Not the kind of person that most people working in the EPA who have an eye toward protecting the environment would envision leading them. Trump named Ben Carson, a neurosurgeon and a former presidential candidate himself, to lead the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Carson had zero experience in issues of housing and urban development. He was a neurosurgeon. He had said before he didn't want to work in government, and yet here he was heading a major department, a cabinet department. Rick Perry was the former governor of Texas, and when he ran for president in 2011, he was running in 2011 for election in 2012. He lost, but he ran. He proposed as part of his campaign platform, eliminating the energy department. President Trump named him to head the energy department, a department he had so little faith in that he wanted to eliminate it. My point is that none of these people are the ones whom the vast majority of civil service employees working in these agencies would have imagined leading them. I'm sure very few of the rank and file civil service employees serving in the EPA or HUD or the Department of Energy shared the political vision, had the same values as Scott Pruitt, Ben Carson, and Rick Perry. Trump can name them to lead the agencies, but the agencies can resist a lot that they would want to do and that Trump would want to do. Presidents can hire and fire the heads of these departments. He can put people like Scott Pruitt, Ben Carson, and Rick Perry in office. He can remove them, demand their resignations. But there are thousands and thousands of people working in the agencies below those leaders, and those civil servants know that they're going to be there for the length of their careers. Administrations come and go. Presidents serve for 4 years, 8 years at the most, and then they're gone. And when they go, these cabinet secretaries and other department heads go with them. The civil servants will remain. And so they know that they have a basis for resisting change to their mission coming from a political appointee who's going to be there for the most a few years. So because of this, presidents have very difficult time controlling their own branch of government. So anyone who thinks that the president somehow is the boss of America, the CEO of America, it's just simply not the case. First and foremost, the president has leadership of the executive branch of government, and we're in a system of divided government and divided separate powers, and so the president can't control Congress, for example, certainly. But on top of that, the president has very little control over his own executive branch of government because of the reasons I just laid out. So with that, we're going to transition now to the broader executive bureaucracy, this vast array of agencies and departments and 4.5 million people working in them that deliver what government does. The bureaucracy is the entity of government that when the rubber meets the road in terms of what government does, depending on your perspective, for you, to you, it's the bureaucracy that does so. And so we're going to switch to that topic now, and I will pick that up in the next section of the class.